They handed her away like a sealed ledger, and the ledger burned. In the first 8 seconds, they will tell you it was scandal. What they will not whisper is the machinery that made scandal possible. Listen close. This is not a tale of pity or madness, but of design. The house favored power over mercy, ritual over law, and barter over blood. I am not your friend or your comfort. I am the hand that opens the iron door and lets you see what men paid to keep hidden. Cypress Grove sat in the hold of a slow river, its wealth sunk in water and sweat, and its smooth parlors were built on choices that left fingerprints on flesh. Silas Rutled loved one thing, position, and that love bent his world into a shape that could swallow a daughter without complaint. He wrote a bargain on paper sealed with a sign that meant more than money, the Brethren's mark. When a man signs with monsters, his signatures become landscapes of cruelty. You are about to watch a map unroll, roads of humiliation, alleys of ritual, the architecture of an exchange that would turn a daughter into currency and then into a weapon. Beware. Hearing this will change you. Of history. Silas expected humiliation to be enough. He expected whispers to fold like shutters and debts to be erased by display. Humiliation was currency in a town that priced status above conscience. He could not imagine that a spectacle could be turned inward, that the same performance meant to stitch his name back into favor could be woven into a trap. Ezekiel moved through the house like someone who knew how to become invisible and then not. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he served, cataloguing small privileges and small contempt with equal care. Names, rituals, who kissed whose hand, which tavern drank silence with their brandy, all of it became a ledger. He began Catherine's recovery with something far simpler than Herb's truth. He stripped away the doctor's poisons one tincture at a time and taught her to read the world again. As her mind cleared, her memory returned like an old wound, opening and bleeding history into the room. The most dangerous thing he taught her was not how to walk, but how to remember. Revenge, when forged patiently, is precise, and its shape is inevitability. They prepared the engine of ruin and lit its fuse carefully. He taught her the geometry of cruelty. Names became coordinates, actions plotted like compass points leading to the center where the brethren gathered. In late afternoons, Ezekiel walked her through the house not as a patient, but as an investigator, pointing at ceiling beams, a seam in the floor, a knot in the table leg, and saying, "Remember this. Memory is a chain, and every link suggests weight." She learned to listen for footsteps 2 rooms away, to read the cadence of laughter, and measure guilt like temperature. They reconstructed the cellar's sounds, mapping who entered, when doors closed, which boots carried ash. Each fact made the facade tremble. Ezekiel cultivated an outer patience that disguised inner engineering. He did not rage, he scheduled ruin. Quiet men with long memories terrify because they need no witnesses, only a plan. Catherine became more than recovered. She became calibrated, a living ledger of offenses. The house grew small, every room a page that could be read and used to indict men who imagined themselves untouchable. In the kitchen, in the nursery, tinder truths accumulated. When dry, tinder is dangerous. They were preparing fire. When that hour arrived, judgment would be absolute. The announcement was ritual in daylight. Silas believed he was performing charity, masking a transaction in civility. The county elite arrived, carriages glinting in the sun. The smell of roasted meats and wine hanging heavy, but the real transaction was invisible. Catherine sat poised, a statue in fine cloth, smiling politely while the machinery of vengeance hummed quietly beneath her ribs. Ezekiel moved among the servants, unseen yet omnipresent, memorizing gestures, subtle alliances, tiny betrayals. Every whispered insult, every sideways glance, every gesture of disbelief was logged, stored, and coded. The room was a chessboard, and they were pieces moving of their own volition, unaware they were playing someone else's game. Silas announced the transfer of authority with a measured voice, expecting shock, expecting gossip. Instead, Catherine's silence amplified the weight of the moment. Behind her composed exterior, eyes flicked like a predator, marking weaknesses, nerves poised to strike. Every man who thought themselves in power was already under observation, already in debt to consequences they could not yet see. The afternoon light traced gilded frames and polished floors, but it could not hide the gathering storm, the return of truth, the slow, calculated corrosion of every assumption they held about control, ownership, and invulnerability. History was about to remember them differently. The first week of treatment was brutal, a crucible disguised as care. Catherine's body rebelled against decades of poisoning, indulgence, and false prescriptions. Fever, trembling, vomiting. Each episode a gate she had to pass through to reclaim herself. Ezekiel never flinched. He held basins, wiped her face, whispered reminders that she was not alone. Each night, he left her with knowledge more dangerous than the herbs. Her body could heal, her mind could remember, and the men, who thought themselves untouchable, were catalogued in her growing ledger of power. Pain became currency, memory became leverage, and obedience was only a performance designed to disarm the house. In those days, Catherine felt for the first time the sharp edge of her own strength, a precision honed by suffering. She began walking short distances, testing boundaries, learning the cadence of control. Ezekiel adjusted meals, replaced pastries with lean meat and vegetables, and insisted that portions be exact, teaching her discipline as a weapon. Their conversations shifted from physical recovery to strategy. Every story Catherine told about the cellar, the late-night visitors, the rituals she had witnessed became fuel. Every hidden ledger of abuse became a blueprint. Their alliance was quiet but absolute. Two minds aligned in vengeance, patiently designing the architecture of ruin. By the second week, the shift was undeniable. Catherine's eyes, once clouded with confusion and fear, now scanned rooms with calculation. She asked questions, tested the reactions of servants, noted the micro-expressions of those who had once dismissed her as mad. Ezekiel provided the framework. She added instinct, memory, and rage honed over decades. Each whispered secret she uncovered, each fact she remembered about the brethren, was a weapon to be wielded. She learned how power is performed, the gestures, the rituals, the appearances that make others submit. In the evenings, they mapped the house like generals, who held sway in each room, who whispered, who lied, who obeyed silently, but watched. Ezekiel shared his own losses, the family Silas had destroyed. Catherine absorbed them, folding grief and fury into strategy. Their bond was forged in pain, sharpened in secrecy. They were conspirators in a world designed to erase them, and that made them dangerous. Every visitor, every servant, every casual insult became a data point. The house was no longer just a prison. It was a theater of leverage, a map of opportunity. The storm had begun quietly. They were preparing to strike, and no man in that house yet understood the height from which it would fall. Catherine's first real test came when her father visited her room unannounced. Silas expected obedience, the docile nods of a woman under medical supervision. Instead, he found a daughter transformed. Her gaze, once vacant, now measured him, calculated risk, assessed weaknesses. Ezekiel stood to the side, silent but present, a reminder of the invisible chains he had forged around every truth in the house. Silas spoke of propriety, of appearances, of the county's gossip, but Catherine answered with precision, not defiance, planting seeds of doubt, of unease. Every carefully chosen word hinted that she remembered more than she was letting on. Every pause, every shift in posture, communicated power reclaimed. That night, Catherine slept not as a victim, but as a strategist. The house, once a place where her father dictated reality, had become a landscape she could manipulate. Each servant, each guest, each shadow in the hall was a piece on a board she now understood. She was learning that the world could be bent, that revenge was not a matter of impulse, but of patience. By the candlelight, She planned the architecture of ruin with a calm born from suffering. Ezekiel watched her silently, knowing the fire had ignited. The first spark of retribution was alive, and it burned in her eyes. By the third week, the house itself had become an accomplice. Every hallway echoed with Catherine's newfound authority. Every glance she exchanged with Ezekiel carried unspoken agreements. She walked with precision, her body now a tool honed for endurance, her mind a ledger recording debts, betrayals, and weaknesses. Conversations in the parlor, once mundane, were dissected, analyzed, stored for later leverage. Silas, proud and blind, believed he was observing a recovered daughter. What he could not see was that she and Ezekiel were architecting the collapse of his world, one conversation, one calculated smile at a time. The kitchen became their observatory, servants' whispers, their intelligence network. Catherine began practicing control over smaller matters: who sat where, who received tasks, who was allowed to speak. Each small victory was a rehearsal for the reckoning to come. Ezekiel, meanwhile, cultivated patience, letting Silas believe he was the master, while he quietly catalogued every detail of the brethren's influence. Together, they transformed suffering into strategy, pain into power. The house, once a prison of cruelty, was now a crucible forging vengeance. Every day, Catherine grew stronger, more aware, more precise. And the men who had thought themselves untouchable were still blind, still arrogant, still waiting to learn the cost of underestimating what they had sought to control. The formal announcement approached like a tide drawn by some unseen moon. Invitations went out, gilded and precise, summoning every man who thought himself a pillar of Colatin County. They came confident, wearing masks of civility, unaware that they were entering a trap constructed of time, memory, and meticulously gathered knowledge. Catherine rehearsed her performance, the polite daughter who obeys and thanks, while inside, every cell of her body memorized every insult, every slight, every crime committed under the guise of authority. Ezekiel moved among the shadows, cataloguing faces, noting reactions, storing grudges and debts owed. He had taught her to read a room like a manuscript, to measure hesitation, pride and fear in the smallest gesture. The day arrived with oppressive heat, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats, polished wood, and the faint tang of fear neither Silas nor the guests could perceive. This was not a party. It was a tribunal, a court of invisible justice, where every attendee had unknowingly become a defendant. Catherine's smile was her weapon, her eyes a ledger, her words calibrated to pierce subtly and efficiently. Every detail they had painstakingly recorded over weeks would converge in a single, devastating calculus of retribution. The game was about to begin. The dining room was crowded, yet every eye fell where Catherine allowed. Silas stood, glass raised, speaking of recovery, of care, of the remarkable skill of the man at her side. The elite murmured approval, little realizing that the very act of witnessing her improvement was a rehearsal for their undoing. Ezekiel served quietly, invisible to most, but seeing everything: the twitch of a finger, the slight pallor at a name, the hesitation in a toast. He was a ghost walking among men who had built their power on cruelty, documenting every weakness, every pattern, every arrogance. Catherine's presence was a lesson in performance, the obedient daughter, the recovered patient, but her mind was a trap, each smile a calculated ensnarement, each nod a ledger entry. Silas believed he had restored his reputation. He had instead unleashed a weapon. By the end of the meal, every man in the room had revealed something they thought hidden, and Catherine, for the first time in her life, felt the full weight of control, not just physical, but psychological, strategic, moral. She understood the rules of power now: patience, observation, timing, and the meticulous collection of truth. The storm that would burn Cypress Grove began not with fire, but with a look, a ledger, and the knowledge that no man could touch what he could not see coming. By the following days, Catherine's transformation became undeniable, not just to herself, but to the household. She moved with authority, her body stronger, her mind sharper, each step measured, deliberate. Conversations that once intimidated her now bent under the weight of her presence. Ezekiel guided silently, ensuring that every act of regained strength was paired with a calculated lesson in observation and control. The servants watched her, some with awe, others with fear, sensing the shift but unable to define it. Silas, however, remained blind, convinced that obedience equaled weakness. He could not see the ledger she carried in her mind, cataloguing names, actions, allegiances, and crimes. Every man who had judged, mocked, or exploited her was now part of a system they could not escape. Each gesture, each carefully chosen word, became a chain linking them to consequences they did not yet understand. Catherine's eyes no longer wavered. They cut through deception, illusion, and arrogance. Ezekiel had given her the tools to survive, but she now wielded them with intent. They were no longer merely recovering from injustice. They were architects of its repayment. The plantation itself, once a symbol of her imprisonment, had become a map. Every corner and shadow a potential weapon, every memory a calculated threat. The reckoning was forming. It was then that the deeper game began. Catherine no longer reacted. She anticipated. Every visitor, every whisper, every glance became data, a thread to pull at the perfect moment. Ezekiel taught her that patience is the deadliest weapon. He had lived years in calculated suffering, plotting justice, and now he had an apprentice shaped by pain and memory. Together they observed the county's elite as they revealed themselves, which men feared exposure, which men relied on arrogance to shield their crimes, which men underestimated too, the power of what they considered weak. Each revelation fed into a strategy that was invisible yet inexorably deadly. Catherine learned to smile while plotting, to appear harmless while cataloguing every failing. The house, the servants, even the garden paths became instruments of intelligence. Every corner was a listening post, every gesture a cipher. The people who thought they controlled the narrative were, in reality, reading a story written by two hands they could not see. And every day, Catherine grew stronger, not just in body, but in the authority she could exert through observation, memory, and psychological precision. The time was coming when patience would turn into action, and what had been meticulously recorded over weeks would erupt into consequences that no one could escape or deny. The midpoint arrived like a quiet reckoning. Catherine and Ezekiel stood at the edge of power, not yet striking, but fully aware of the leverage they held. They were no longer merely surviving, they were architects of destiny. Ezekiel leaned close and whispered a command that would seal their alignment, a phrase to be spoken twice, aloud, as a recognition of identity, commitment, and engagement, not just between them, but with the forces shaping history. The ledger remembers. The ledger remembers. Repeat it. Say it twice. Let it echo in your mind. Every man, every whisper, every act of cruelty they had documented would now be imprinted with intent. Catherine's hands, once trembling, now wrote invisible contracts in the air, each movement a calculated step toward inevitable justice. The house itself seemed to sense the shift. Shadows stretched longer, rooms felt smaller, and the air thickened with the weight of suppressed truths. Ezekiel taught her that history favors those who remember and punish with precision. Every table, every hallway, every gaze exchanged with unsuspecting men was a prelude. Their patience had made them dangerous. And now, with the phrase repeated, they declared their readiness. No one outside understood it yet, but within that room, power had been claimed. The reckoning was no longer optional, it was certain. With the phrase spoken, the transformation solidified. Catherine moved through the house with authority that no title could grant, no law could sanction. Every gesture was a statement, every glance a calculated strike. Ezekiel and she had become a single force, a measured hurricane waiting to uncoil. Servants who once feared her father now deferred to her subtly, sensing the invisible ledger she carried and the patience with which she would use it. Silas remained blind, enthralled by the illusion of control, unaware that his daughter, once dismissed as mad and weak, now embodied power that could dismantle him piece by piece. Each meeting, each meal, each casual encounter became an opportunity to test the balance, observe weaknesses, and mark targets. Catherine's memory catalogued everything: gestures, patterns, loyalties, and lies, creating a lattice of inevitability. The house, the plantation, the county elite, all were now fields of data to be harvested at the precise moment. Ezekiel ensured every action was timed, every reaction predicted. The subtle accumulation of weeks, of pain, of strategy had created a weapon far sharper than any blade. And within Catherine, the knowledge of what must be done burned like a constant drumbeat. Every heartbeat was preparation, every breath was patience, every step forward carried the weight of inevitability. The hour of action approached silently, without fanfare, without warning. Catherine and Ezekiel no longer whispered. They moved as calculated forces, invisible yet omnipresent. Every guest, every servant, every man who had built his pride on cruelty unknowingly stepped into a web of observation and consequence. The knowledge amassed over weeks, the ledger of offenses, the careful cultivation of patience, all converged into a moment that would fracture illusions of power forever. Catherine's hands were steady, her mind sharp, her body disciplined. She had become the instrument of justice no one dared name. Ezekiel watched, guiding, ensuring timing was perfect, knowing that subtlety, precision, and inevitability are deadlier than open force. The house, once a prison, was now a theater of calculated judgment. Each hallway, each room, each overlooked detail became a conduit for control. No man suspected the storm behind polite smiles and measured words. And yet, in that calm, the full weight of vengeance waited, patient, inevitable, and unrelenting. Those who had thought themselves untouchable would soon understand the cost of underestimating the quiet, the observant, and the disciplined. Cypress Grove had become a crucible, forging not victims, but agents of reckoning. The final act was near, and the consequences would echo far beyond the walls of the plantation. When the reckoning struck, it was silent at first. A series of small, precise disruptions that grew into unstoppable collapse. Servants whispered truths previously buried, alliances crumbled. The men who had believed themselves untouchable discovered that every gesture, every arrogance, every crime had been recorded, catalogued, and weaponized. Catherine moved like a shadow of inevitability, her presence alone demanding obedience, her words unmasking guilt without accusation. Ezekiel guided her, a quiet strategist, ensuring that every action hit its mark. Cypress Grove, once a symbol of cruelty and control, became a monument to precision vengeance. Fires of accountability spread not with chaos, but with methodical certainty. Reputations dismantled, secrets revealed, power stripped from those who thought themselves immune. Silas, who had manipulated and sold, now faced the ledger of his own making, the cost of arrogance, cruelty, and obsession laid bare. Catherine's eyes reflected a clarity forged in pain, rage, and deliberate patience. She was no longer a victim, no longer a pawn. She was an agent of justice, calibrated to deliver consequences with the inevitability of history itself. And as the smoke settled over Cypress Grove, the lesson remained. Power can be observed, catalogued, and returned with interest, and those who underestimated it will never forget the reckoning they invited.